Hello and welcome. I want to talk in this video about the psychology of Walter White, the fictional character from the TV series Breaking Bad. Our first impression of Walter is that of a crumpled, self-defeated man. Now, we can see quite clearly that he's in a passionless marriage. His wife is almost like that of a mother figure to him, coddling him. And his son, he has cerebral palsy, and you can see the frustration his son directs at Walter, right from the opening scenes. And we sense he sees Walter as a failure. A man who can't purchase a new water heater for his family and provide for them. And Walter, he's working as a chemistry teacher. The chemistry itself, the only spark of passion in his life. And he's working a second job in a car wash to make ends meet, so he can barely pay the bills. And those around him, his family and his colleagues, they demean him, they humiliate him. And his brother-in-law, Hank, he constantly derides him for not being a real man. And Walter's ridicule and his abuse, it's a source of entertainment to everyone around him. So he feels he failed in life. And the words of Mice and Men, the saddest thing is what's never been. And Walter is certainly living those regrets. And the character on the show, Mike Trout, he compared Walter to a ticking time bomb. Now, that Walter's course would only be one that would see him self-destruct, in turn destroying everything around him. And he was right. And Mike saw clearly the psychology of this man, the ego and the insecurity that drives him. And when Walter was younger, he had the world at his feet. And he helped found a company that would go on to make billions. And he contributed to a Nobel Prize winning chemistry team. But he sold his share in that company for a few $1,000s. And also because he felt the woman he loved had betrayed him. So we see a definite pattern with Walter. Now, the psychological makeup had prevented him from achieving great heights. So he carries the past into the present. And the feelings of betrayal and insecurity and bitterness, they brim just below the surface in every interaction. So all the elements were present. As Walter said in his first cook, the reaction has begun. And when Walter receives his diagnosis of terminal cancer, his coping mechanisms, they fail him. This is a man with no release, who has no identity, who receives no respect. A man existing in a state of constant deprivation. And many have argued that Walter shifted from being a loving family man to a psychopath. But in truth, Walter loved his family, even though he used his family to justify his actions. And those actions were brutal. But in Walter's mind, the ends justified the means. Walter, he felt crushed by a societal expectation of him as a man. And he also felt like he never had control over his own life. And just like men today, society gives pressures to them to conform to a model that doesn't serve or benefit men in any way. It only deprives men. So Walter, he's conforming to an expectation that marginalizes him. And he feels he's been emasculated. He feels he's been cheated. And that he hasn't fulfilled his promise as a man. Of course, all this serves to make him very sympathetic in the eyes of the viewer. This desperation and lack of empowerment is what many in the audience have experienced personally, or are experiencing. So Walter is essentially holding a mirror up to the audience. And the question posed is, if you had a year to live, what would you do? Would your inhibitions be lessened? Would it make you a better person, or would it make you a worse person? And Walter is living this reality. And with facing his mortality, all of his past failures, they become all too apparent. This is a man that's been pushed to the edge. The stereotypical father figure on a TV sitcom, who's finally woken up to who he is and how he's perceived. But he's trying to climb a mountain he can never ascend. Yet with power only comes more loss of control, and a constant need to further validate himself. So, it's an empty cycle. His ego trying to override his insecurity. But bottom line, the most denigrated figure in society today is the father figure. And the creator of Breaking Bad, Vince Gilligan, he once stated that Walter's character arc was him going from Mr. Chips to Scarface. It could be seen as Homer Simpson or Ray Barone finally finding their balls and saying fuck you to the society that mocks them. In Walter's case, he's a teacher and a father, but neither roles are respected in today's society. So he's a walking punchline. And there's a crushing feeling of guilt on Walter. Now, it's very evident from the opening scenes. It's the guilt of failure. We see it in Walter's body language. He's very careful around people. He's crumpled, like he's caving inwards. A man beaten down by life. And he's unable to hold eye contact with people, even with his own son. The guilt is too great. As he hasn't achieved the sort of success he believes he deserves, but still, he's a proud man. He's unable to take anything that resembles charity. And Gus Fring, the meth kingpin, he felt he understood Walt's psychology. And Walt, he originally wanted out of the meth business because he feared he was alienating his family. And Gus, he played on that. And Gus stated to him, when you have children, you will always have family. A man provides. And he does it even when he's not appreciated or respected or even loved. He simply bears up and does it because he's a man. So some would say that Walter, he saw his role as provider. Now, even if his actions cost him the love of his family. And, how many men have trodden this path? To only lose their family's love by bearing up and being a man. And the question in Walter's case is, how does Walt view his role as a man? Now, how does he view his success? So Walter's definition of masculinity it seemed to be always evolving. The goalposts, they keep shifting. Now, he's constantly redefining his agenda and his definition of what success means to him. And what's very telling is that once Walter is free from his enemies and all his outside threats, now Jesse advises him he should cut his losses and get out. Now that his family is now set financially. And Jesse asks him, he says, are we in the meth business or the money business? And Walter replies, neither. I'm in the empire business. So the betrayal and the guilt and the insecurity, they still define him. And there's many opinions on what motivated Walter. But our perception of Walter's motives, really, they say more about the audience than it does Walter, as his motives are constantly adapting to the situation. So we need to question, are his family simply extensions of his ego, chess pieces to move around the board? Or is his true motivation to provide for them? And Walter, he only once talks about his father, and how he was a distant man. And Walter states he didn't want to become like his father. But in many ways he has, and this increases his guilt and his feelings of personal failure. So we gain a portrait of Walter. Now, as a child, he was in emotional turmoil, but he suppressed his pain, in turn numbing his emotions, losing himself in chemistry, where he was very much capable and very much in control. But this in turn, it gave way to a deep depression. And when confronted with his diagnosis, that suppressed emotion, it comes to the fore. He's unable to cope with or regulate these emotions, as his coping strategies, they're non-existent. So he becomes impulsive. His ego no match for his insecurity. But the truth is, expectations placed upon men today, they're extreme. They're often completely unrealistic. And men are still expected to conform to traditional gender roles that marginalise and disadvantage them legally and financially. And men, they constitute 93% of workplace deaths. Yet men, they justify and mitigate this risk as being part and parcel of being male, of being a father, of being a husband. And really, is this any different from Walter's justification for his actions? And really, the reasoning is the same. In men's health, it's vastly underfunded in comparison to female health funding. And Walter, when asked by his family to undergo chemotherapy, he initially refused, as he felt he would be a burden on his family. So male suffering, it's swept aside in our society. Men and women, they internalise and normalise this message. And Walter's reaction to his cancer diagnosis, it mirrored this. And masculinity, it's degraded 24/7 by the media. The bias against males, it makes it impossible for men and boys to achieve these expectations. The incentives and the support have been removed, or are completely non-existent for males. So a lot of Walter's appeal comes from his circumventing these conditions and empowering himself through very ingenious methods. So he's a sympathetic figure in many ways. But he constantly challenges our sympathy by committing heinous acts, or lying, or manipulating. But these societal expectations, they're just one part of Walter's justification process. And there's a psychological theory. It's called escalation of commitment. And that's when a person's behaviour leads to negative consequences. And then they'll frame it differently in their mind. They'll see the action not as negative, but rather as necessary, or that it was a positive action. So even if an action is negative or harmful, they might continue that behaviour or increase it, convincing themselves that it's necessary or justifiable. Of course, now anything is permissible. And we see this behaviour with people who believe in a doctrine, a doctrine that relies on false statistics and is easily refuted as propaganda. But it's simply too painful for them to accept that they've been lied to, or that they're being manipulated. And plus, coming to terms with the fact that you may have hurt innocent people, it makes sense that many find it easier to dig their feet in, and find ways to ease their mental discomfort and disassociate themselves from their actions, by often dehumanizing or depersonalizing others. Such is the cases when Walter, he poisons a child, or when he dissolves the corpse of a child in acid. So Walter, he's experiencing excitement for the first time in his life. And the danger, it's incredibly stressful. But what's very noticeable is his cancer goes into remission for the period that he's making meth, while his life deteriorates all around him. And the cancer only returns when he quits the meth business. And the cancer literally eats him alive when he loses all control of his life. So it could be seen that the cancer itself was brought about by feelings of helplessness. And many have argued that Breaking Bad is representative of patriarchy in all its horrific glory, castigating women and promoting violence and all the evils associated with maleness. Of course, one look at the character of Lydia, one of the most callous people on the show, who orders killings with about as much compassion as ordering a coffee, we see that that's false. And with Skylar as well, how she handled Ted. And when she stated, what's one more death in regards to killing Jesse. So again, how we interpret Walter's actions says more about us. And Walter's perception of criminality, it seems to come right out of the movies. It's his only frame of reference. And he desperately needs to control everyone around him because he's in over his head. And he overcompensates to a staggering degree. And anyone who stands in the way of that goal is disposable. Of course, the one line he wouldn't cross is essentially hurting his own family. But the reality he created for himself was one where he was protector and provider. That he could somehow outsmart everyone around him. But once Hank died, he had to face reality and the fact that decisions he made were for himself. And the reality crushed him. And Walter, he had real love for those close to him. But at this point, his sense of morality was so corrupted, you couldn't tell whether he was being truthful, whether he was still manipulating those around him. He'd lost all perspective. And all that was left is a memory of Heisenberg, a persona he could never live up to. And much like his previous life, attempting to live up to an expectation made him miserable. So Walter, he came to a point where he was forced to question his life and his role as a man. And in today's society, many men, they're doing the same. And the messages males receive from childhood is that masculinity is damaging, that it's perverse, it's oppressive. And traditional expectations of men, they've crippled men, crippled them financially and emotionally. And yes, Walter's decisions, they were inherently selfish, but the standards and the expectations he set for himself were derived from societal messages. Essentially an extension of the American dream. The father providing for his family, the masculine directive, what have you. And Walter, he stated in the first episode that I am awake. But after all the bloodshed and the suffering he caused, the only time when he was truly free was right before he died. And he finally faced his truth, and he made peace with himself, and the evolution was complete. Anyway, that's all I wanted to discuss tonight, but thank you for your time, and keep on trucking. Thank you.